This one's gonna get really nerdy. Hang in there with me, okay? In the comments section of all of my videos, I get a common theme. Everybody asks about the backlight or the contrast or how a different screen looks compared to another watch. And there's so many watches out there right now. I'm just gonna settle it today. We're gonna compare all of the GPS and fitness watches that I actually have in my possession right now, side by side, to see who has the best displays in terms of resolution, color, contrast, all that stuff. We've got a whole bunch of GPS fitness watches on the table today. There's different brands and different categories, and we're going to compare all of them side by side, but only in terms of their displays and their LCD panels and all that stuff. If you want to see videos about detailed specs and GPS accuracy and the other stuff, make sure you check out the other videos on my channel, because I do have in-depth reviews for all of the watches on the table on my channel. And speaking of that, if you find this video helpful or entertaining, make sure you give me a thumbs up down below and consider whacking that subscribe button so you don't miss more videos from me in the future. I would really appreciate that, because I'm putting a lot of work into this stuff. Also, if you're considering picking up any of the watches on the table here, I will have links down in the description. Those are affiliate links. They do help support my channel, but they cost nothing extra to you. And finally, if you've noticed this really stylish hat I'm wearing, this is the Chase to Summit Technical Trucker hat, and I just got these in stock a couple of days ago. There's a limited supply, but these things are amazing, super comfortable, breathable, great for active sports. So check out the merch store down in the description if you want to pick one of these bad boys up. With all that out of the way, let's get into it. Right off the bat, we're going to separate the categories here. Some of these watches, like the Apple Watch, have OLED or LCD display that's really bright and vibrant, where the other watches are transflective or memory and pixel displays, and those are a little bit duller, so they can't really compare side by side. For instance, if I was to hold up the Ticwatch Pro 3 that I have here in my left hand and compare it to the Polar Grit X that I have in my right hand, you can tell that the Ticwatch Pro 3 has a much brighter display. This super bright OLED display is really awesome, and it's a standout feature on a lot of watches. However, this kind of display does suck down battery like crazy, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, whereas the memory and pixel displays, they just sip on battery and they can last a really long time. There's kind of a trade-off there. If you want the really bright display that's great for reading text messages and emails and stuff like that, or you want that memory and pixel display so you have really long, great battery life. The other trade-off a lot of times with the really bright display is that they don't stay on. They're not an always on display. That's not the case with all of these types of watches, like the Apple Watch Series 6, but like the Ticwatch Pro 3 GPS here, this one turns off, even though it does have another display underneath it that actually is like an analog clock. But yeah, a lot of them do turn off, so that's kind of a disadvantage if you're running or you're riding a bike or something. You just want to glance at your watch real quick to see what time it is, or your distance or your pace or whatever. Okay, now that we've talked about the two different categories with the OLED or LCD displays and then the memory pixel displays, let's separate them and then talk about them individually. Here's my collection of really bright display watches. I'm not going to call them OLED or LCD because they're all a little bit different. We've got the Suunto 7, the Apple Watch SE, the Ticwatch Pro 3, and we've also got the Polar Unite. Like I said, this is just my personal collection, so there are definitely more watches out there with OLED or LCD displays, but these are just the ones I have right now. As you can see, I'm having a bit of a struggle getting them on all at the same time because of the screen timeout, but yeah, there's a screen timeout on all of these. They turn off by themselves, so it's kind of frustrating. Let's work from left to right so I don't have to do this battle of trying to keep them on. This is the Suunto 7. This has a really bright, super bright OLED display, and it's really beautiful. You know, it's very smooth, it's got a high refresh rate, very crisp, a lot of detail there. You can read text messages on it very easily, and I really like this display. It's also quite large because this is a pretty large watch. Next up, we've got the Ticwatch Pro 3, and again, this does have a really nice bright display. It isn't quite as bright as the Suunto 7, but I think they did that because this one has a touch better battery life, so they tried to balance both worlds a little bit more. The Suunto 7 basically has to charge every day if you're using it and running and doing daily life with it, especially if you set it to always on display like it is right now. But the Ticwatch Pro 3, you can get like 2 or 3 days out of it with normal use. Even though it's not quite as bright as the Suunto 7, it is really nice, and it's, you know, easy to read even in direct sunlight. The Polar Unite's a unique one because this is actually a pretty inexpensive watch, but it does have a really nice display on it. It's very bright, very vibrant. This is not an OLED display. This is LCD because this is a cheaper watch, but you know, I really like it. And finally, we've got the Apple Watch SE, and everyone knows that Apple makes great products. They make great displays. There's no exception here. The display on the Apple Watch SE is quite contrasty. It's very colorful, color accurate. It's just a great overall display, and it's super smooth. They must have a really high refresh rate on this, or it's just their OS just feels really polished when you're using it. So if I had to rank these overall best to worst, I would probably say that the Apple Watch takes the win here because it's so bright, super fluid. Second place would definitely go to the Suunto 7 for having a really nice, crisp, contrasty OLED display. Third place would go to the Ticwatch Pro, and then last would be the Polar Unite, which is not surprising. That's a $130 watch. These other watches are $200 to $500, so big difference in price point here. All right, now we're looking at the memory in pixel or transflective displays, whatever you want to call them. From left to right, I've organized them in manufacturer. This one's a little bit more confusing because there's so many of them. Basically, I'm going to compare each watch and each brand. I'm going to pick a winner from each brand and then put them up against each other tournament style. First off, we've got Polar. So I've got the Polar Grit X and the Vantage V2 here. Let's take a look at their displays with the backlight off. So as you can see, the Polar Vantage V2 is just a little bit easier to read. It's probably because the screen is pretty dirty on my Grit X. Let me just wipe that off real quick. So if you compare the Vantage V2 to the Polar Grit X, they're actually very similar. They probably have the exact same display, but things change a bit when you look at the backlight. Okay, now we've got the lights turned off and we can see the backlights of the Polar Grit X on the left here and the Vantage V2 on the right here. And one thing to note is that the Vantage V2 does get just a little bit brighter, and that's because the Vantage V2 has a light sensor built into it. So when it's dark, it knows it's dark, so it boosts up the backlight a little bit, whereas the Grit X on the left here just has a fixed backlight. There's no brightness levels, it doesn't have a sensor, so that's why the Vantage V2 has a bit of advantage here. So let's go ahead and just give the win to the Polar Vantage V2 from Polar, so that goes up to the next level of the tournament. Let's go on to the next brand. We have Garmin. This is probably where most of the comments come from, where I see people talking about backlights and bluish displays and washed out displays. It's always about Garmin's, because here's the thing. I posted a video like a year ago comparing the Fenix 6 Sapphire against the Fenix 6 Pro, and they both had different kinds of backlights, so it gave the illusion that the Sapphire got a nicer display because it cost more money, but that's not the case. Thing is, Garmin appears to use different vendors for their LCD panels, so each display can be different depending on where you buy it, what model you get, how old the stock is. It seems to be that it's kind of luck of the draw whether or not you get a really nice contrasty display or you get something that's kind of washed out and hard to read. I've got a little of everything on the table here, so let's go through it. I've got the Garmin Instinct Solar here, I've got the Forerunner 945, the Fenix 6S, and the Forerunner 745. With the backlights off, it really comes down to what glass material was used on the watch to give you that visibility during the day in direct sunlight. My Fenix 6S here has a sapphire crystal display, and sapphire, while being very durable, it transmits less light and it also causes more reflections. And because of that sapphire display, it appears dimmer even in direct sunlight compared to something with a Gorilla Glass display like the Instinct Solar here. On the flip side, if you put a screen protector like a lot of people do on your Instinct Solar or your Forerunner, it's going to appear even dimmer than a sapphire display without a protector. All right, so if we kind of angle off the watches towards the light as if we were in the sun, you can see that the Fenix 6S has a lot more reflections. It's also just much harder to see. It's a dimmer display because of that sapphire crystal. And I'd say the one that's most visible is the Instinct Solar because it has a monochrome display. It does not have a color display like the Forerunner 945 and 745 that I have here. The 945 and the 745 are also very visible. They're kind of tied with each other and they both have the same size display. Even though that the housing on the 945 is larger, the bezels are thinner on the 745, so you get a smaller watch with the same size display. Now here's where the controversy comes. We're going to turn off the lights and see how the backlights compare to each other in terms of contrast and sharpness. Again, I did not change my camera settings for this shot. This is the same exposure settings for all of the watches throughout this entire video. And here's where things get weird. On the left here, you can barely see it, but if I cover the light with my finger, you can. This is the Instinct Solar. All of these watches are set to 50% brightness, even the Instinct Solar, but the Instinct Solar is barely able to put out any light. It's super dim. That said, in person, it is totally usable. Like, I can read what's going on here, but it's way dimmer than any of these other watches like the Fenix 6S or the Forerunner 945 or 745. Okay, now next up, I'm putting my finger over it. This is the Garmin Forerunner 945. Again, these are all at 50% brightness, and the Forerunner 945 is easily the brightest and most contrasty of all four of these watches. After that, we've got the Fenix 6S here, where I'm covering it with my finger. This is also at 50% brightness, and it's kind of in between the Forerunner 745 that I'm covering right now and the 945 over here. So if you look at the Forerunner 945 on the left here and the 745 on the right here, when I turn them at an angle, you can see that visibility is sustained way better on the 945 compared to the 745. And again, let's compare the 945 on the left and the Fenix 6S on the right, and when I turn this at an angle, the Fenix 6S actually has way better visibility when I'm at a sharp angle, and I don't know why. The Fenix 6S has great contrast, but it's not quite as bright as the 945. And then finally, let's look at the Instinct Solar compared to the 945. You can barely tell the Instinct Solar is actually in this shot, but if I shake it around a little bit, you can kind of see it there, where the 945 is just super clear as day. I don't know if it's by model or if it's luck of the draw, like which backlight you'll get when you buy a watch, but I wish it was a bit more consistent. So if I had to rank a winner here, it's pretty complicated because the 945 is the brightest, the Fenix 6S actually has the most contrast between black and white, the 745 has that bluish kind of washed out display, and then the Instinct Solar has a really great display in direct sunlight, but when you turn on the backlight in the dark, it's pretty dull. I guess when it comes down to it, I would probably pick the Fenix 6S as the winner because I really like that contrast, even though it's not quite as bright as the 945. I think the 945 and the Fenix 6 here both have great backlights. Oh yeah, I've got one more brand to cover that wasn't included in my lineup. Coros. I've got the Apex Pro and the Coros Pace 2 here. So again, these have very similar displays, but the difference is going to be that the Apex Pro has a sapphire display, whereas the Coros Pace 2, because it's a much cheaper watch, has a Gorilla Glass display. That means the Apex Pro will be much more durable, but the Pace 2 will just be a little bit more visible in the sunlight. And you can see with their backlights on, they're both very similar in terms of visibility and angles that you can see them at, but I will say that the Pace 2 just looks a little bit more contrasty. The whites are a little bit whiter and the blacks are a little bit blacker, but to be honest, both of these appear to be just a little bit more washed out than the other brands. So as far as Coros is concerned, I'm gonna pick the cheaper Pace 2 because it has just a little bit more contrast in the display. That's not to say the Apex Pro is a bad watch, it has way more features, but we're just talking about displays in this video, so goes to the Pace 2. Okay, only 4 remain. Let's see what we got. We've got the Wahoo Element Rival, the Fenix 6S, the Polar Vantage V2, the Suunto 9 Barrow, and the Coros Pace 2. Still hanging in there, the Coros Pace 2. Okay, so in terms of visibility in the sunlight, it's kind of hard to see. Again, the sapphire displays on the Suunto 9 Barrow and the Fenix 6S are going to be hurting them in the sunlight, even though they're perfectly fine and visible and definitely easy to see when the sun is really blasting on them, but they are a little bit dimmer than the Gorilla Glass displays on the Wahoo Element Rival, the Vantage V2, and the Coros Pace 2 here. Here's the weird thing. I think I'm going to give the win in terms of daylight visibility to the Coros Pace 2 here on the end. It just seems a little bit crisper in direct sunlight. Maybe it's because the glass is a little bit thinner on here, so there's less interruption between my eyes and the actual LCD panel. Let's go ahead and turn off the lights and see what the backlights look like on all these different watches. Okay, so we've got the Suunto 9 Barrow here, we've got the Wahoo Element Rival here that you can barely see. I'm trying to show you where it is. And then we've got the Garmin Fenix 6 here. We've got the Polar Vantage V2 here, and finally the Coros Pace 2 here on the end. Right off the bat, you can tell that the Wahoo Element Rival is definitely lacking in backlight. It's very difficult to see. It's not very bright at all. And again, there's no brightness setting to turn that up, so I can't even make it compete with these other watches. So I'm gonna remove the Wahoo Element from the equation here. It definitely doesn't have the best backlight or display in this lineup. Okay, with the remaining watches, I think that it's kind of a toss-up. The Coros Pace 2 is actually really bright, but again, it is pretty washed out compared to the Garmin. The Polar Vantage V2 certainly isn't bad. It's really kind of right in the middle, maybe even tied with the Garmin Fenix 6. And then the Suunto 9 Barrow is probably the dimmest here, and it's, you know, kind of washed out. It's definitely not the best display on the table. So if I had to pick a winner, I'm gonna go with the Garmin Fenix 6S again. I'm really trying not to be biased here, but it just, to my eyes, appears to have the best looking display. Okay, so that kind of wraps up this video. The winners are the Apple Watch SE for that bright OLED LCD category, and the Garmin Fenix 6S for that memory and pixel transflective display category. But again, they're in totally different categories. You've got like a day of battery life here, and you've got 2 weeks of battery life here. This is purely my opinion. It's just me in a room looking at all these different watches and telling you what I think about them, so take that for what it's worth. Anyways, that's a long road to this final conclusion. If you found this video helpful or entertaining, please whack that like button down below. It really helps out my channel, and consider subscribing so you don't miss more videos from me in the future. Boy, that was nerdy. I wonder if you're gonna thumbs down this. Are you gonna thumbs down or are you gonna do the up? That's all I've got for this one. I'll see you in the next one.